all know about Galileo, the revolutionary 17th century astronomer persecuted by the church for the daring assertion that we are not, in fact, the center of the universe. And we all know about the scientific method, the tried and true set of steps that scientists follow in their effort to generate knowledge about the natural world. But what if I told you were lied to about both? You don't know shit about Galileo or the scientific method. Because it turns out that Galileo, a supposed father of the scientific method, is actually an excellent example of how this is not it. Trust me, I have a literal PhD in astrophysics, so I know a thing or two about who orbits whom and how I got to learning that. But my goal today is not to teach you about solar system dynamics. It's to share some philosophy about the endeavor of science itself. What is it? How do we do it? And what any of that means for us as a society. Sound obscure and academic? It is! So Galileo's big claim to fame is that he helped shift scientific consensus in Europe from the geocentric model, where all the cosmos orbit a stationary Earth, to the heliocentric model, where the Earth rotates on an axis and revolves around the sun like all the other planets. And the legend of Galileo is that the Catholic Church suppressed him because none of those words were in the Bible. It usually goes that the regressive Catholics didn't want scientists teaching heretical ideas, so the Roman Inquisition censored heliocentrists, insisting that the sun orbits the Earth. God said so. For some context, Galileo didn't come up with the idea of heliocentrism. That was actually Nicholas Copernicus, who published his model some 70 years before the Catholic Church declared it formally heretical in response to Galileo reviving it. But you might be surprised to learn that Galileo's trial wasn't only about whether or not heliocentrism was consistent with scripture. The theory was also evaluated on the basis of its scientific content. And on that basis, it was found to be, quote, foolish and absurd, not based on the opinion of theologians, but on the assessment of other notable scientists, many of whom agreed that Galileo's case didn't hold up. So Galileo wasn't censored because the church was anti-science. Galileo was censored because the church found his claims unscientific. And here's the wild part. They weren't wrong. I mean, they were wrong about Galileo being wrong. The Earth definitely orbits the sun. But they weren't wrong to say that his claim did not meet scientific standards, because it didn't then and it wouldn't now. But the problem wasn't Galileo's methods. It's scientific standards. Don't believe me? Excellent. That means you're about to learn something. How exciting for you! The explanation's pretty involved, so we'll break it into 2 acts. In Act 1, we'll step through Galileo's surprisingly weak case for heliocentrism. We'll go over his theoretical arguments, the evidence he used to support them, and how his methods, while seemingly unorthodox, were and continue to be essential for the progress of science. Then in Act 2, we'll shift from why such unorthodox methods are good for science and look at how they might also be good for society. What do we lose from representing the scientific method more narrowly than science is actually done? And what could we gain from adopting a broader understanding of it? We're doing heady science philosophy today, so cancel your plans, grab a snack, and brace yourself for an hour plus of listening to my vocal fry. So here's the argument against the Earth's rotation that Galileo had to contend with. If you stood at the top of a tall tower on a rotating Earth and dropped a stone, the Earth and the tower should rotate away from the stone as it falls, so the stone should land some distance to the west. But when we've dropped stones off towers, they fall straight down. Ergo, Earth is not rotating. Now maybe you can already see why this doesn't work. When you drop something from a tower on a rotating Earth, it still lands at the base because it was already moving with the Earth when you dropped it, and famously, an object in motion stays in motion. At the moment it's released, the stone has the same motion as the tower in the direction of the Earth's rotation. So in absolute space, the stone does actually fall in an arc. But if you're an observer moving with the Earth, the only thing you'd see is the stone's motion relative to you and the tower, not its absolute motion. Even if you can't explain this in physics terms, you probably understand it intuitively. But that's only because we've long had ideas like Newton's third law or empirical evidence that the Earth rotates. And so our sense of things like motion, how it works, and what kinds of it we can and cannot see are informed by our context. At the time of Galileo, though, they didn't have that context. What they had were their eyes, which could see things fall straight down, and Aristotelian physics, which was premised on the motion that you see being all the motion there is. The medieval experience of instantaneously concluding absolute motion from visible motion is an example of a natural interpretation, an explanation of ordinary experience that seems self-evident because we don't notice the hidden piece of logic in between some sensory experience we have and the statement we make to describe it. Galilean era people weren't going through the mental process of see rock fall in straight line, think visible motion is all motion, and then conclude that the rock is therefore truly falling in a straight line. The middle step was unconsciously taken, because within the context of the existing language and metaphysics, Copernicanism was patently false. The rock falls straight down. We can all literally see it. But that's the deceptive obviousness of natural interpretations. The tricky thing about natural interpretations is that while they clearly limit our ability to identify better stories in cases like this, we also kind of can't do science without them. Natural interpretations are all we got. We literally can't speak or even think an idea without potentially inadvertently creating them. But even past the starting point, trying to take an existing theory and analyze it for natural interpretations is kind of futile. That analysis is probably being done through the same frameworks that the theory was developed in. So the analysis would necessarily have the same blind spots as the thing being analyzed. So if we can't analytically find the hidden incorrect assumptions in our long-standing theories because our analytical tools are tainted by the same hidden incorrect assumptions, how do we find them? Well, by entertaining theories that contradict what we already believe. Theories that look wrong. At least that's how Galileo did it. Instead of asking what's wrong with the tower argument, he simply asserted that heliocentrism was correct and then asked, what would have to change in order for this all to make sense? To answer this, he appeals to analogy with an example of shooting a gun on a boat. Whether the boat was anchored or sailing, the way you would aim for and shoot at some point on the boat wouldn't change. You wouldn't compensate for the boat because you intuitively understand that everything on the boat is moving as a unit. As another boat-based analogy, he said to imagine sketching with a pen on a piece of paper on a long sea voyage. Even if the ship is moving the whole time, the drawing is fine because your hand, the pen, and the paper are all moving together. The big motion doesn't leave a trace. Only the small relative ones do. As a note, these are not logically robust arguments. They're proposing situations that people can easily imagine and then saying, yeah, so what if Earth was like that? Without any evidence for the analogy holding. But even if he could have justified that comparison, he still wouldn't have disproved the conclusion of the tower argument. He didn't provide an argument for the Earth's rotation. He just showed how this particular argument against it could also be consistent with it. Under the old natural interpretations, a rotating Earth predicts falling objects move in arcs, so the lack of those arcs proves the Earth is at rest. But under the new natural interpretation from the boat analogies, a rotating Earth predicts that there's no relative lateral motion between the stone and its starting point, and so all the falling stone shows is that there's no relative lateral motion between the stone and its starting point. Now again, I need you to look at this not through our 21st century eyes, but through the eyes of a scientist back then. If Galileo presented you with his boat analogies, you'd probably be like, cool theory, bro, but can you prove it? We can see today how holding up a demonstrably wrong theory did in fact help Galileo identify an incorrect natural interpretation that was preventing scientific progress. But that's not the same as arguing for the correct interpretation. He had effectively no theoretical basis for believing heliocentrism over geocentrism. Those theories wouldn't be available until Isaac Newton published his work on universal gravitation decades after Galileo's trial. All Galileo's shown is that, at least as far as the tower argument goes, Heliocentrism and geocentrism are degenerate. Not degenerate like me. Degenerate like when two situations explain the same observation, but the observation alone can't distinguish which one's right. The boring kind of degeneracy. And if you were a scientist who came up at a time when geocentrism was supported by the physics, had many observations that were consistent with it, and had successfully made predictions that were useful, you'd have no reason to abandon all that for a competing theory that's main argument boils down to, but like, what if the Earth was a boat? You tell Galileo to come back when he had some goddamn proof. And you might be thinking, isn't that what he did with the telescope? He proved it, right? So the tower argument was about whether or not the Earth rotates. But as you'll recall, the Copernican model also asserts that the Earth, like the other planets, revolves around the sun. And here's the refutation for that point. If Earth orbited the sun along with, say, Mars, then sometimes we'd be on the same side of the sun, and sometimes we'd be on opposite sides, which means the distance between us and Mars changes a lot. If that were true, we'd expect Mars to look a lot bigger when it's closer to us and a lot smaller when it's farther away. But when people looked, that's not what they saw. Mars's size didn't really change much. This would be consistent with a situation where Mars orbits Earth and is therefore always at about the same distance from it. So once again, heliocentrism was considered debunked. Now the simple story is that Galileo made his telescope. It worked very well. And when he observed Mars through it, he measured changes in its size that were consistent with predictions from the Copernican model. Proof! Evidence. Cold, hard facts. And to an extent, the story is true. Galileo did make a telescope, it did have certain demonstrable abilities, and when he observed Mars through it, he did detect the predicted changes in its size. But there is more to the story than that. To start with, Galileo didn't understand how telescopes worked. Like, straight up, his writings just don't contain a theoretical underpinning to justify the veracity of his telescopic observations. He hadn't read the seminal text on optics until after he made his famous observations, and even then, he admitted himself that he didn't understand the math. Instead, it seems like Galileo developed his telescope through trial and error. And even though it worked well enough to impress people when used on familiar things like counting windows on a distant palace, it was met with skepticism when pointed at the sky. For one, because people at the time believed that Earth things and space things were made of fundamentally different stuff and subsequently obeyed different physical laws, and so there was no obvious reason to jump from trusting the telescope in terrestrial contexts to celestial ones. But also, the telescope itself had serious problems. The images it produced were often distorted, with obvious artifacts like skewed shapes or colored fringes. This wasn't such a problem for Earth things where you'd immediately clock any distortion because you know what a tree is supposed to look like. But if you're looking at space things that you've never seen up close before, how are you supposed to tell what's real and what's a telescope glitch? Today we know enough about optics to understand these artifacts. We know what in our images is coming from the telescope and what's coming from space, so we can correct for them in our instrument design or post-processing. We can also use this knowledge in hindsight to say that the artifacts in Galileo's telescopes didn't undermine his observations of Mars that supported heliocentrism. But back then, there were plenty of good reasons not to trust the telescope. One student of Kepler's said it worked great on Earth, but produced illusions like double stars when pointed at the sky. Others noticed that looking at the moon, they could only see features like craters in the central part of the moon, but the outer edge appeared to be perfectly smooth. And others found that they couldn't recreate Galileo's famous observations of Jupiter's moons, with some even saying that they doubted he had made them at all. Not that it matters much, because while Jupiter having moons did mean that things can orbit things besides the Earth, that's not the same as evidence for heliocentrism. And the same goes for him observing the phases of Venus. He detected changes in its visible shape that showed that it orbits the sun, but that doesn't prove that the Earth does too, it just suggests it by analogy. And there were even models at the time that resolved these observations, for example, by saying that the other planets do orbit the sun and they can have their own moons, but the sun is still orbiting the Earth. Now, an observation that would have directly evidenced the Earth orbiting the sun is stellar parallax. Parallax is that thing where if you're looking at something in front of your face and change which eye you look at it through, it appears to move relative to the background, and It appears to move more the closer it is to your face. Try it. We can all look ridiculous. Astronomers use the same principle to measure the distance to stars. But instead of comparing the view from two different eye positions, we compare images taken from opposite points in the Earth's orbit. Scientists in Galileo's time knew this. They knew that if the Earth orbited the sun, they should see parallax in distant stars. But Galileo's telescope couldn't detect it. Turns out that's because the stars were much farther away than anyone realized at the time, meaning the shifts would be a lot smaller and need a much stronger telescope to detect, so it wouldn't be another 200 years until Frederick Bessel was able to make that observation. But at the time, the apparent lack of stellar parallax seemed like solid observational evidence against heliocentrism. And remember that this, along with all the evidence for heliocentrism, was based on observations from a demonstrably flawed telescope. So not only was the telescope Galileo used to support heliocentrism highly suspect, but it could also produce observations that directly contradicted heliocentrism. So if you were hoping for the telescope to produce unassailable evidence supporting Galileo's wild speculation, I'm sorry to inform you, but the data is just as wobbly as the theory. And if you're thinking I might still introduce the secret third thing in Galileo's methodology that alchemizes his flimsy evidence and out there conjecture into a satisfying little proof, I hate to disappoint, but it's not coming. To recap, Galileo took a refuted theory, argued that it could be true, and backed it with a cherry-picked subset of the available observational data, some of which outright contradicted his claim. And yet, he was right. So what's that about?
Science is an essentially anarchic enterprise. Theoretical anarchism is more humanitarian and more likely to encourage progress than its law and order alternatives. The only principle that does not inhibit progress is anything goes.
So that provocative claim is the thesis of German philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend's 1975 book Against Method, which is where most of the information you've heard so far comes from. And what he means by anything goes is that it's impossible to devise a universally valid set of steps that dictates how one does science that won't eventually stifle its progress. For any scientific rule, there is a useful counter-rule, a time when that rule should be broken. So what rules did Galileo break? By my count, he defied 3 commandments of the scientific method. Yes, we're doing a Bible motif.
Commandment 1. Thou shalt ground thine hypothesis in established knowledge.
So this commandment is what Feyerabend calls the consistency condition, which is the requirement that new hypotheses agree with well-established theories, which is often a good rule of thumb, but clearly an obstacle when it comes to Galileo trying to advance heliocentrism. He didn't build off the existing body of accepted knowledge. He revived an idea that had long been dismissed by the scientific community. Feyerabend argues that this move of actively choosing to explore hypotheses precisely because they contradict well-established theories is necessary for the progression of science for a few reasons. For one, because the consistency condition biases us towards whatever theory came first, not necessarily because it's better, but just because it came first. Think about it. The theory that came first has more time for people to get used to it, to find supporting evidence for it, to build more knowledge around it. Of course, a new theory is going to look weak in comparison. Feyerabend hilariously likens it to arranging a fight between a grown man and a baby, and then being like, oh wow, the man won, I guess the baby never had it in him. Now, some might be inclined to argue, well, can't we just decide when a theory is ready to be replaced when we discover enough facts that don't support it? But like we saw with the natural interpretations in the tower argument, sometimes facts used to support or disprove a theory inherit the same assumptions as that theory. Take Brownian motion. It's the jittery movement of particles in a fluid that scientists had long observed, but under the previously dominant theory of heat, just seemed like a weird curiosity. It wasn't until Einstein applied an alternative theory of heat, which is the one we use today, that Brownian motion was seen to contradict the previous theory. Without the competing framework, the anomaly would never have registered as a problem at all. So collecting enough facts isn't enough to tell us when an old theory is ready to be retired. Sometimes you don't need to look harder, you need to look through a different lens. And that's why sometimes pursuing a hypothesis we already know is wrong is the only way to reveal how wrong we really are.
Commandment 2. Thou shalt discard theories thou hast falsified.
Falsification. You test a theory with data, the test and the theory disagree, you abandon the theory. Popper in a nutshell. Don't worry, we'll get to him. So let's recap the data Galileo had. His telescope succeeded in observing some things heliocentrism predicts, it failed in observing other things heliocentrism predicts, and it also produced very clearly unreliable representations of the sky. Is the data consistent with the theory? Hard to say. Some of it might be, some of it might not. All of it definitely either does or doesn't. What's much easier to say is that the telescope did not produce irrefutable evidence of heliocentrism by any standard. And it turns out, that was fine. An ad hoc hypothesis is an explanation made up after the fact to explain why some test of a theory didn't work. And they're viewed very skeptically in science. Which makes sense in a certain light. Like if you only came up with that explanation after something falsified your theory, then aren't you caring more about protecting your theory than seeking the truth? Sometimes maybe. But sometimes cherry-picking only the bits of data that support your theory and explaining away the bits that don't brings about the Copernican revolution. Just like with accepted theories, accepted facts aren't self-sufficient. They have built into them observational artifacts, hidden assumptions, unknown unknowns. And this is why Feyerabend makes the argument that sometimes you just gotta make an excuse for bad data. Like with the missing stellar parallax observation. Galileo explained it away by saying that maybe the stars are a lot farther away than we thought, and so the shift is too small to observe, and that's why he can't see it. In hindsight, he was right, but he didn't have any way to know that. It was just a lucky guess. But an ad hoc explanation doesn't have to be right to be useful. Galileo explained away one of the obvious problems with his telescope by saying, that's actually something weird that your eyeballs are doing, and the telescope corrects the thing that your eyeballs are doing, so what you're seeing is the image as it really is without the eyeball effect. Which, to be clear, was complete BS. History is filled with wrong but useful ad hoc hypotheses. Newton's theory of universal gravitation, which effectively concluded the Copernican revolution, was one of the most significant advances of physics there have been, but it also relied on God holding up the stars to explain why they don't fall in on each other. And Einstein did pretty much the same thing with the cosmological constant. To sum up in a mantra Feyerabend repeats throughout the book, no theory agrees with all the facts in its domain. And that's why the whole just test your hypothesis part of the scientific method is a little more flexible than we let on.
Commandment 3. Thou shalt let rationality be the final judge of truth.
So if Galileo didn't have strong arguments or evidence, what was he using to advance heliocentrism? Well, mostly a lot of psychology and rhetoric. Take the boat analogies from earlier. That wasn't proof, it was just a metaphor. And not even a strong one, being that at the time, people believed Earth stuff and space stuff obeyed different laws. Even so, these analogies provoked people to think in a different way than they were defaulting to. It simulated a new kind of experience in their imagination. This is one of a few places in Galileo's writing where he appeals to the reader remembering something they already know to kind of trick them into believing something new. He couldn't rationalize heliocentrism, so instead he rewired people's sense of what was intuitive, weakening their trust in the tower argument without directly refuting it. Besides analogies, which at least feel adjacent to arguments, Galileo cultivated an impression of obviousness around Copernicanism through an aggressively persuasive writing style. A lot of Galileo's work was published as dialogues between a Galileo stand-in and a foolish geocentrist, and when the foolish geocentrist asks fake Galileo at some point why he's so certain of a claim that he hasn't tested, fake Galileo says, "Without experiment, I am sure that the effect will happen as I tell you because it must happen that way, and I might add that you yourself also know that it cannot happen otherwise, no matter how you may pretend not to know it." What follows is fake Galileo walking foolish geocentrists through a highly speculative and hand-wavy proof, after which the latter concedes the inarguable correctness of the former. And I've seen enough of what Facebook did to boomers to know that a confidently presented but materially weak argument can be very compelling. Galileo even just lied sometimes, like claiming he had a theoretical basis for his telescope optics when it appears he did not. Feyerabend calls all of this Galileo's propagandistic machinations, aimed not quite at proving heliocentrism, but at keeping it alive until better proof had the chance to catch up. And listen, I'm not trying to say lying and manipulation is good science. I'm just saying These were his methods, and by most standards, they were wildly unscientific. But that's exactly Feyerabend's point. If an idea doesn't yet fit existing facts or theories, it might need irrational tactics to survive until it can be justified more rigorously. Which makes me think of dramatic physics PR, like the branding around the Higgs boson. I get it was an important part of the standard model, but come on, the God particle? The God particle? Once again, physicists who can't help but invoke God. But also, that language created a lot of public interest in an esoteric physics thing while the data was catching up with the theory. So the takeaway with this last of Galileo's scientific heresies is that scientists are engaged in a messy social process in which things like language and persuasion are necessary to advance ideas before more rigorous methods have the chance to. And I hope that at this point it's not controversial to say that Galileo argued for what is now scientific consensus through thoroughly unscientific methods. And this begs the question, if he wasn't following the scientific method to advance heliocentrism, what was he following? What motivated his ardent support of Copernicanism when it was so clearly flawed? What was driving his scientific inquiry, if not pure reason? Well, what Galileo saw in Copernicus's theory and his telescope's data was not evidence, but what Feyerabend calls harmony. He saw one factually wrong thing, the heliocentric model, and another factually wrong thing, his telescope images, and somehow his intuition convinced him that these things together are a compelling argument. Each individually refutable thing was enough evidence to believe the other individually refutable thing. The telescope supported the theory's trueness at the same time as the theory supporting the telescope's trueness. I know it sounds like I'm explaining this in circles, but that's kind of just what it is. Like, writing this script, I kept finding myself with the Sisyphusian task of trying to rationally describe an inherently irrational process. There's no satisfying way to do it. I don't think I have a better way to articulate what's going on here than Galileo saw something interesting, trusted his gut, and ran with it. Haters be damned. To reference Einstein for a third time for some reason, there is no logical path to the laws of the universe. Only intuition, resting on sympathetic understanding of experience, can reach them. What I'm getting at here is that sometimes the methods of science are surprisingly vibes-based. Every step of Galileo's process required leaps of faith that are not nicely spelled out in the scientific method. But he was right, and he's one of the most well-remembered scientists in history. So if that's the case, why on God's rotating and revolving Earth did we all learn the scientific method the way we did? I might actually have an answer for that. But before I tell you what I think, how was Galileo able to keep arguing for heliocentrism? I don't mean conceptually, I mean materially, financially. Like, who was bankrolling him? Well, he had patrons, rich guys in robes who were like, you know what? I like this weird little man and his funny stories about the universe. Let him cook. I, too, am able to do somewhat unconventional scholarship thanks to the help of patrons. But instead of the Medicis, my patrons are randos like you. This channel is funded by donations from the members of my Patreon who, in addition to helping me live my best independent scholar life now that Doge fired me, get exclusive access to patron-only perks. That's not a joke, Doge actually fired me. Patreon perks include Q&As, interviews with other creators and academics, and ad-free versions of all my video essays. But my favorite feature has to be the book club, where we have weekly discussions on books like Against Method, which we read together last summer. So if you're interested in reading with us, getting exclusive content, or just generally supporting my work, you can join the Patreon for as little as $3 a month at the link in the description. And to those of you who already are, thank you again. You have made my experience of fascism dismantling our country's education systems at least personally weatherable. Wow, what a downer. What can I say? This is where we're at. Hope the political talk isn't too off-putting, otherwise the rest of this video is gonna be roof. So the process that Galileo engaged in, where he pursued an idea in contradiction with established theories and facts in order to reveal the incorrect assumptions they were built on, is what Feyerabend calls counterinduction. And to make sense of why we singularly teach the scientific method at the expense of other methodologies like counterinduction, I want to look at the philosophy underneath these methods. The main epistemological basis for the scientific method as you learned it in school is Karl Popper's critical rationalism. Is that a simplification? Yes. Anyways, Popper is the philosophy of science guy from the last century. Like, without fail, anytime I have ever heard physics bros talking about philosophy, they always reference him. And less anecdotally, he's a big deal because he solved David Hume's problem of induction. Induction is generalizing laws from observation of particulars. If you stab a balloon and it pops, you can inductively reason that stabbing balloons makes them pop. But the problem with induction is that the experience of something particular doesn't guarantee the generalization. You can't know for sure whether every single balloon ever would pop unless you try stabbing every single balloon ever. So Hume's problem with induction is that it's the only way to generate scientific laws, but there is no way to prove inductively reasoned laws will always hold. And Popper didn't solve Hume's problem so much as sidestep it by saying that the point of science is not actually to prove anything. It's to disprove things and see what's left. Popper's philosophy of critical rationalism says that since we can only be certain when something is false, we should design tests to disprove our theories, abandoning the ones that we falsify. And while surviving attempts at falsification doesn't make a theory true exactly, the more we've tried to falsify it without succeeding, the stronger it is. So to Popper, scientific knowledge is not perfect truth, but merely the body of theories that have survived falsification. Which is a bit ruthless, right? Like, it's very survival of the fittest, very trial by fire. Loki is giving eugenics. This is a fundamentally different conception of what knowledge is and how we acquire it than Feyerabend's, which follows directly from his argument for counter-induction.
A scientist who wishes to maximize the empirical content of his views must adopt a pluralistic methodology. He must compare ideas, and he must improve rather than discard the views that have failed in the competition. Knowledge so conceived is not a series of self-consistent theories that converges towards an ideal view. It is not a gradual approach to the truth. It is rather an ever-increasing ocean of mutually incompatible alternatives, each single theory, each fairy tale, each myth that is part of the collection forcing the others into greater articulation, and all of them contributing via this process of competition to the development of our consciousness.
So if Popper's falsificationism is eugenics for ideas, Feyerabend's epistemological pluralism is like intellectual polyamory. And as I just spent the last half hour explaining, it's well motivated. Galileo's story shows us that adhering to strict falsificationism, in Feyerabend's words,
would wipe out science as we know it, and would never have permitted it to start.
Pretending we can decree a theory ultimately finally falsified ignores messy problems like what exactly the burden for falsification is, and under what circumstances a falsification should be reconsidered. Feyerabend's epistemology leaves space for the messiness that Popper's denies. And as someone who has done research, I know what a messy bitch science is, so the recognition of that mess seems needed. Like, astrophysicists will look at a discrepancy between data and model and be like, I introduced a parameter eta, not for any reason except for it would make my data do something interesting. Y'all remember eta? The real ones remember eta. But messy reality aside, Popper is science philosophy orthodoxy. In physics and astronomy, at least. I'm sorry, Hume, I can't help but induct. And I think that Popper's epistemology is ubiquitous while Feyerabend's is niche, because Popper is way more ideologically consistent with the culture of modern science. Not to claim causality, of course, I'm just noticing some interesting alignments. Harmonies, if you will. Let me ground what I mean in my area of expertise. Education. So the idea of falsification as a means to generate knowledge aligns remarkably well with the mainstream ethos of teaching science. And I don't mean that professors are teaching students about falsification as an idea. I mean they're teaching students by intellectually hazing them. Think things like professors designing intentionally difficult weed-out classes, or creating unnecessarily competitive research environments, or just generally being a dick to students who dare ask for help because they sincerely think tough love is effective pedagogy. And don't even get me started on the gross sense of pride some faculty have about their program's high failure rates, as if that's some testament to their academic rigor and not evidence of their failure as educators. There's this strong cultural belief in physics that some have it and some don't, which, in a Popperian framework, implies the role of the educator is to identify and elevate the pre-existing geniuses by putting students through as much difficulty as possible and abandoning the ones that struggle. It's applying critical rationalism to people, trying to falsify their ability rather than nurturing it. And this is a bad way to approach teaching as a whole. This doesn't produce a good learning environment for anyone, but it has particularly egregious impacts on minoritized students. I'd explain how, but I already did that in the chapter of my thesis that's not about black holes or telescopes, so you can go read that if you need proof, whatever that is. So when extended to the process of training new scientists, Popper's philosophy rationalizes practices that gatekeep who becomes a scientist and who doesn't, in ways that are driven far more by social forces than rational ones. Another boundary critical rationalism offers philosophical justification for is demarcation, or the difference between science and not science. This is a line that has been debated for millennia, and Popper solves it with the criteria of falsifiability. If the closest we can get to proving something is to try to falsify it and fail, then scientific inquiry is only concerned with things that can be falsified. So if you can't devise a test that could theoretically prove something wrong, if you can't do the scientific method on it, it's not science. Contrast this with Feyerabend, who just straight up doesn't believe in demarcation as a useful concept, and insists that the wrong theories that one would use in the process of counterinduction can come from literally anywhere.
The alternative theories, which he needs to keep the contest going, may be taken from the past as well. As a matter of fact, they may be taken from wherever one is able to find them, from ancient myths and modern prejudices, from the lucubrations of experts and from the fantasies of cranks. The whole history of a subject is utilized in the attempt to improve its most recent and most advanced stage. The separation between the history of a science, its philosophy, and the science itself dissolves into thin air, and so does the separation between science and non-science.
There are so many great examples of unscientific knowledge systems not only providing valuable information, but also illuminating some shortcomings of scientific approaches in their respective domains. A great one is the practice of controlled burning, in which indigenous communities across North America would use low-intensity fires to manage land, not as outsiders taming an ecosystem, but as participants in it. But colonial governments, following a Western model that saw nature as separate, static, and best preserved through non-interference, banned the practice, leading to decades of worse wildfires before they realized that the putatively unscientific approach was actually more effective. So for Feyerabend, the fact that unscientific knowledge can be used to sharpen scientific knowledge means there's no reason to demarcate the two to begin with. Knowledge is knowledge. Looking back at Popper, the initially practical-seeming criteria of falsifiability now feels overly restrictive. Gatekeeping what knowledge can and can't be brought into the process of science only limits us. But like the gatekeeping of potentially great scientists on bullshit survival of the fittest criteria, it serves a purpose to power. The line between science and not science defines a binary. And as soon as humans define a binary, a hierarchy is born. Because people don't think in terms of science and not science, but still potentially useful for growing knowledge, people think in terms of science you can prove, and bullshit that you can't. Which is silly, because even for Popper, you really can't prove anything. But even so, questioning the line that defines this hierarchy can easily be shut down with appeals to the uniquely undeniable robustness of critical rationalism. So in conclusion, the myth of the singular scientific method isn't just inaccurate, it's ideological. It reflects and reinforces a hierarchy of knowledge, where science, as defined by Western academic institutions and done by the special few allowed within their ivory towers, is treated as uniquely legitimate, and everything else is dismissed as superstition or pseudoscience. And that hierarchy isn't neutral. Historically and today, it's been used to marginalize the epistemologies of cultures exploited by post-Enlightenment white guy science. To be clear, I'm not saying Popper's philosophy causes societal harm, and I don't think it's inherently exclusionary either, but it is really good at drawing clear boundaries and perpetuating itself as the singularly reliable. And I think that's why the myth of the scientific method persists. not because it's the best or only way to generate knowledge, but because it's ideologically useful. It gives science an unassailable authority while keeping out anything or anyone that might challenge the existing order. So for both science and society, our baby understanding of how science works is limiting. And if we want either to progress, we must concede to Feyerabend. Anything goes. Cue conclusion. Wait, is there some huge hole in this argument that I'm forgetting? So here's the counter-argument I anticipate to Feyerabend's hippy-dippy, all-knowledge counts approach to science. Yes, boundaries can be abused, and that's bad. But science needs strong boundaries to maintain its authority. If scientific knowledge is going to contribute to the public good, then the public needs to believe it. And if we want people to believe it, we need them to trust that our methods and processes are rigorous and reliable. Otherwise, flat Earth. Now, usually when I preempt a counter-argument to something that I'm saying, it's because I can guess what someone who thinks differently than me might say. But in this case, this is my own internal debate. Like, I am sincerely picking up what Feyerabend's putting down. I see the value in his philosophy so clearly. But at the same time, there were so many moments reading against method where I was just like, yes, flat Earth. To that end, what follows is the result of me being genuinely curious about how to reconcile this. First, I asked myself, how would we know when we should abandon the scientific method for other methods of inquiry? To put this in terms of another science philosopher, Thomas Kuhn proposed that science moves between cycles of normal science and revolutionary science, where the former refines existing paradigms and the latter replaces them with new ones. I wanted to say, well, critical rationalism maps onto normal science very nicely, and counterinduction seems like the kind of method that brings about paradigm shifts. But I think the point at which the shift needs to happen can only really be identified in hindsight, so the option of counterinduction always kind of has to be available. Then I thought, well, maybe it's a utility argument. The assumption of a round Earth is more useful in countless contexts, so the lack of utility is what discredits flat Earth. But again, Galileo's story shows us how this can also be a premature appeal to hindsight. Eventually, I started to think this is kind of just a feature of Feyerabend's anything goes, like maybe you can't apply a method to the philosophical rejection of method. I've been going around and around with this, and I really haven't been able to come up with any real-time way of dismissing anti-scientific movements like flat Earth without relying on a hard line between scientifically validated knowledge and pseudoscientific nonsense. But there was a conceptual wall I kept circling back to every time I tried to entertain this question of, in an imagined world where culture and institutions adopt Feyerabend's epistemological pluralism, how would we avoid the problem of flat earthers? And that is, flat earthers are already a problem! Like, why should the burden of proof be on Feyerabend to protect science's authority when the existing mode of science, with Popper as the philosophical default, already lacks public trust on the scale that it does? So rather than try to figure out how epistemological pluralism could possibly contend with a threat to scientific authority like flat earthers, let's proceed in a somewhat counterinductive way and wonder how the current scientific milieu might have produced it. Conveniently, I found a paper written by 3 professors of science education from Brazil that examines the way flat earthers talk about their beliefs on social media, specifically through the lens of Feyerabend's work. Using flat earth content as data, they argue that the movement is best understood not as a simple rejection of particular scientific beliefs, but as a reaction to the rigid, exclusionary way science presents itself in society, what Feyerabend would call scientific dogmatism. And according to them, it's this perceived dogmatism in science that inspires mistrust in it. The segregation of rival discourses is what gives scope to the establishment of science in society. In confrontation with this, possibly due to a reaction to this segregation, the generalized mistrust in relation to science can be considered the condition for the establishment of conspiracy discourses, such as that of the flat Earth. You can check out the paper to read more, but the point is, it is exactly the maintenance of scientific authority through unquestionable boundaries that drives people to adopt flat eartherism as a means to reject it. Which makes a lot of sense. conspiratorial thinking in general relies heavily on a free-thinking us to contrast with an authoritative and exclusive them. That us versus them maps on really well to the us versus them that falls out of a strict Popperian demarcation between science and non-science, especially when you add on the notoriously exclusive gatekeeping of scientific institutions. And also, like with other conspiracy theories, flat Earth isn't just about flat Earth. It's usually believed along with other anti-science claims that individually seem just as incoherent, but collectively have a coherent logic of rejecting truth as presented by the compromised scientific establishment. And while I don't think they're right about the shape of the Earth, I can't say that they don't kind of have a point. Galileo's story shows us that science has always been messier than scientists let on, and when the gaps between that real messiness and the pristine facade that science is often presented with become visible, it makes a lot of sense to ask questions. And while I do think there are satisfying answers to those questions that don't necessitate undermining scientific expertise, unfortunately, believe science isn't one of them. So ironically, the Popperian ideal of demarcation, when wielded to safeguard scientific legitimacy, ends up solidifying the very us versus them binary that groups like flat earthers traffic in. And the stricter and more self-righteous the boundaries of science become, the more attractive it becomes to stand outside them. Another thing worth pointing out here is that once we have movements like flat earth, traditionally, scientific approaches don't really offer a way to diffuse the problem. Purely rational methods of scientific argumentation just aren't adequate for combating incorrect scientific beliefs that are ultimately more about power than astronomy. Like, it'd be one thing if people who are interested in the shape of the Earth were also engaged in other related topics of alternative revolutionary scientific study, but as Dan Olson showed in his excellent Flat Earth video, the whole thing functioned basically as a pipeline to QAnon. And I think it's generally true that anti-scientific movements have political functions. Vaccine hesitancy isn't about medicine or virology, it's about bodily autonomy and the freedom to make parenting decisions. Climate denialism isn't about atmospheric science or ecology, it's about protecting financial interests, or preserving a worldview in which only God can change the Earth so drastically. So given that the origins of anti-scientific movements are about politics and power rather than scientific inquiry, I think it's unlikely that doubling down on facts and reason will make the problem go away. Because you can't science someone out of a belief they weren't scienced into in the first place. It reminds me of this conversation I had with a moon landing truther who wasn't persuaded by the, hour of technical arguments I, a literal astrophysicist at the time, laid out for him as to why it did in fact happen. But he immediately reconsidered his whole stance when I offhandedly asked, "Do you really think that the Russians would have let the US get away with faking this big a win in the space race for all these years? That's all it actually took." Sometimes, convincing people that science is real requires stepping outside of the arguments science can provide, at least depending on your definition of science. I guess Feyerabend might make the case that since the irrational forms of persuasion Galileo used were necessary to advance heliocentrism, unscientific communication can count as doing science. So in addition to potentially avoiding the problem of flat eartherism taking hold to begin with, Feyerabend's pluralism provides a more tractable way to engage with its believers. I guess protecting science's authority might be less about arbitrarily insisting that science is super special, and more about understanding its limitations, and why some feel shut out by it. To better understand how people relate to scientific authority, I want to pose this video's discussion prompt. For those of you who are new to my channel, I like to end these with a question for viewers to discuss in the comments section, so we can all learn from each other, instead of pretending I know everything. And I share some of the answers at the end of the next video I make. So my question today is, why do you trust science? What makes you believe something scientists claim to have found out? Or do you not implicitly trust science? Do you have some criteria for scientific claims you believe or don't? And if you've ever changed your mind about believing some scientific claim, what made you do it? As a bonus question for any science-doing people in the audience, what do you think adopting Feyerabend's philosophy might look like in practice? I haven't thought on this too much yet, but I imagine some of you might already have ideas, and I'd love to hear them. Leave a comment with the keywords discussion prompt and your thoughts, and check out what other people have to say, because I imagine the collection of perspectives that y'all have will do a way better job of answering this question than my singular take. And this is what I think science needs more of. Not authority, but complexity. Because that's ultimately what Feyerabend was saying with Against Method. Anything goes isn't a call for chaos. It's a demand for honesty about how complicated science really is. We're talking about the laws of the universe, for God's sake. Can we really pretend we've already figured out the best way to contend with all the knowledge in the universe? The universe? Listen, I make videos about physics for YouTube. I get the need to sometimes simplify as well as anyone. But if making these videos has showed me anything, it's that people are a lot more interested in the meaty, messy, complicated parts of science than I think a lot of scientists give them credit for. And I get it. It does feel safer to explain science as a tidy set of fun facts from behind a veneer of infallibility. But being dishonest about our own authority as scientists has consequences. And personally, I think that if you believe advancing scientific literacy is a valuable thing to do, then breaking down the veneer and being honest about the mess that's always been behind it is the only way forward. Or, subscribing to my Patreon so I can keep doing it. So I've spent a lot of this video's runtime explaining to you all the things Galileo didn't do, but I want to finish it off by stepping back and asking as holistically as possible, what exactly did he do? We associate him with the Copernican revolution, sure, but what exactly was Galileo's contribution to that lineage? He didn't come up with the initial idea, he didn't develop a coherent physics for it, and he didn't provide compelling evidence for it. So if he wasn't the ideas guy, the math guy, or the evidence guy, I guess you could say he was the hype man. I mean, Feyerabend's whole point with this case study is showing that Galileo's key role was abandoning the scientific method because he just really had a good feeling about this one, guys. No coherent theory, no strong data, just a bunch of interesting overlaps between disparate bits of wrong knowledge, inspiring him to make lots of unrigorous and unscientific arguments. So ironically, the essential thing that Galileo Galilei, revolutionary scientist persecuted by the church, contributed to the Copernican revolution was faith. Wait, is she really pitching faith as the moral of this science talk? I know, it sounds like a stretch, but just hear me out. Faith is an interesting concept as a scientist because choosing to believe something you can't prove feels antithetical to our whole thing. And there's definitely something comforting in a standard where every belief needs to be justified and every claim backed by data. But Galileo didn't have that. And neither, frankly, do most scientists at the edges of discovery. It's easy to think his story is a historical fluke, that Galileo just got lucky or something. But Feyerabend's point is that this kind of intuition-driven, unmethodical work isn't the exception. It's how science often moves forward, especially during its moments of revolution. Not by strict adherence to rules, but through irrational sparks that only after the fact get smoothed into a story of logic. And if you take that spark out of science, you get something cold and dead and rigid, claiming to be objective, but only working to reproduce its own stubborn dogma. Reality is not orderly, it's uncertain. And science doesn't remove that uncertainty so much as build through it, feeling its way forward in infinite darkness with tools that are always gonna be a little imperfect. And the older I get, the more I find myself okay with that, not just as a physicist, but as a human. As a very, science-pilled young person, I used to be very averse to the concept of faith in the sense of believing anything that hasn't been rigorously proven. I was your typical physics bro, just super committed to thinking about everything as particles, all the time, always. Looking back, I think I personally held on to that way of thinking because being good at physics and math and stuff was very intellectually validating. So projecting those modes of thinking into other contexts was a way of asserting my own legitimacy when confronted with things I didn't have better tools to understand. But over time, and with exposure to other such tools, I couldn't get around the fact that blocking myself off to ideas that I can't rationally justify 100% didn't seem to serve me. Like, I don't believe in astrology per se, but I do see the utility. That was half joke and half sincere take that you'll have to wait for a future video to hear, so subscribe and hit the bell. But when I say faith, I'm not just talking about the woo-woo or religiosity even. I mean having faith in things you can't yet be certain about, generally. Things like the possibility of building a life you're excited to live when you haven't yet experienced that. Or the possibility of a better future for humanity that we can somehow still salvage from our current existential crises. It's easy to rationalize pessimism, and the comfort of confidence is nice. But learning to sometimes step away from the cynical certainty and into the more irrational space of unsubstantiated hope has legitimately helped me cope mentally and emotionally with things. And learning all this stuff about Galileo, I noticed that coming to understand his irrational motivations and methods that still drove science forward kind of softened the physics bro part of me that still tries to reject any kind of unprovable faith. And at a time where there are so many very rational reasons to feel a whole lot of despair, when it sometimes feels like despair is the point and resisting it is a critical political act, I get a weirdly logical solace from the fact that Galileo's faithful commitment to what he irrationally believed in brought the reality he imagined into existence. So I guess the moral of the story is, in science like in life, faith is good actually. Hello and welcome to the end of the video. Thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed it. In a second, I'm going to share some of the comments I got in response to the discussion prompt from my last video. But before I do that, I gotta tend to some things. If you got something out of this video, I would really appreciate it if you hit like, left a comment, subscribe to the channel, maybe even shared the video with somebody. And if you have a few dollars to spare, which I realize not everybody does in this economy, signing up to the Patreon would really help me out. It has all those cool benefits I talked about earlier, but you know, most significantly, it allows me to continue making these videos that everybody can watch for free on YouTube. And I've made so many, you should go check them out. All the names going by on the screen right now are the current members, and I'm just going to repeat my gratitude for them in these uncertain times where I'm so glad I did not put all of my eggs into the nest of academia. So yeah, give me algorithm attention and money if you can / want to, and yeah, let's get to the comments. So to catch anybody up who didn't see the last video, it was about Einstein and how he was extremely engaged in progressive political activism, you know, like while being one of the most notable scientists ever, and kind of encouraging people to find the ways to use whatever position they occupy in their jobs or community or life or whatever to advocate for social causes they care about. And in particular, I was talking about the social cause of Palestinian liberation, which is relevant to Einstein because he actually spoke about it a lot. Despite being Jewish and a Zionist in some senses, Einstein was extremely vocal about the unacceptable harm the Zionist project was doing to Palestinians. So what I asked viewers in the discussion prompt was, what does your particular position allow you to do in service of whatever cause it is you care about? And people took this question in all kinds of directions, like with regards to different social issues, though I'll probably be sticking to the ones that are specifically about Palestine. But they also kind of took the question differently in terms of like position like a job or position like an identity. And I'll share an example of both to show you what I mean. So the first commenter answers from the position of a university engineering student who's been working to counter the presence of arms manufacturers on their campus, where apparently these companies will have students advertise for them through like flyering and group chats. At Funicchio says, my MO was to aggressively post links of all the terrible things these companies were responsible for anywhere they put their promotional material, and whenever other students rationalized or defended it, I try to keep giving them more historical background and a thorough argument for the responsibility the military-industrial complex has on changing history for the worse, the personal moral responsibility that their technical employees bear, and how to avoid contributing to them. I also distributed lists of companies who were under boycott by BDS or otherwise impacted in the genocide in Gaza before big hiring events. And they kindly left some notes for people who wish to replicate this. Don't do it alone. Every friend you can get to back you up exponentially increases how convincing you are. Never get into arguments where you're just exchanging insults. And remember, when people show up to shout you down or troll, you never have to convince them. They already made up their minds. Use the opportunity to expose more evidence and make arguments that may be convincing to neutral bystanders. I like this example as showing something that students in university contexts can do. I mean, over the last year, we've seen what students in a university context can do when it comes to protesting investment in genocide, but the specifics of this are something really helpful for a lot of people, I'd imagine. The other example is a comment from a Jewish German ex-Israeli, meaning they grew up in Israel, but their family is from Germany. And they describe the especially harsh nature of pro-Palestine repression in Germany because of its particularly fraught history with anti-Semitism and the subsequent unique position that Jewish people in Germany have to challenge this dynamic. So Et Peleg Sap says, so what can we do? I think that Jews in Germany have an obligation to counter this narrative, to clearly say, no, you don't get to use our history to justify and support genocide and ethnic cleansing. This is still possible to some degree since in Germany, when Jews talk about the topic, people still listen to some extent. They're definitely not shutting us completely like they do Palestinians. So we must use our voices to support and elevate Palestinian voices here. Apart from trying to dismantle this connection between Zionism and Jews and to call out the cynical use of the Holocaust to perpetuate a genocide, we also in practice take part in pro-Palestinian actions if we're invited to, and sometimes even use our name to bypass restrictions on Palestinian organizations. It's a silly situation, but it did happen in the past that Palestinian organizations couldn't get spaces for events, but we could because we have Jews in our name, and we then let them use said spaces in our name. So that's what I offer German Jews who want to help. Think about how you can use your voice as a Jew to support Palestinians, to make other Germans listen to them. So that was a wildly powerful thing to read, and a very specific identity perspective that I hadn't encountered yet. But it kind of goes to show how different types of people are kind of in better positions to be believed when they speak on behalf of something. Another really interesting perspective I got was a comment from an Israeli physics student, and I partially wanted to share this one because I think it's really heartening to have my comment section expose me to Israeli people that I'm ideologically aligned with, because the same way there are Americans here who challenge America, there are Israelis there who challenge Israel. But they also ask a very good question. Ed Yovzak says, for the last 6 months, I'm deep in activism fatigue. It got me after about 18 months of protesting, donating to Palestinians, and fighting the increasingly hostile and heartless attitudes towards Palestinians popping surprisingly all around me, even in close friends. Being right here, seeing what my people do, it hurts too much. I had to take a break. But since then, I could not find the strength to come back. It all feels so pointless. How do I return? How do I balance? How do I navigate academia, activism, and my personal life while avoiding burnout and also having a real effect? So that hits really hard. And, just like I said, that there are analogs to Americans like me in Israel who are fighting against things their own country does. We're feeling that same fatigue here too, The burnout you talk about is something I see in activists and organizers here. And I have spoken to this question in a video before that I'll link here or something, but I also wanted to share a potential answer from another comment on this video who speaks from the position of 16 years as an animal rights activist, and they've seen a lot of people who, for one reason or another, be it burnout or something else, leave the cause. So Gorilla Bunny says, I've tried to understand why I've lasted when so many others have not. One reason is that I have a strong sense of justice and I will make certain sacrifices for it. But another is much more mundane. It's the community of passionate people. They're not just people I do activism with, they're also my friends with whom I share hobbies. Activism then isn't just something political, it's hanging out with the homies. So while I don't think we can force people to make sacrifices for their activism, I think that building communities around shared interests will help us identify people who want to. And those communities will also automatically act as peer support when we're struck with doomerism, and we can appreciate the fact that we're surrounded by people who care and are doing something about it. So instead of trying to build an activist movement, it might be more sustainable to build a community from which activists emerge. It would take a lot more work and time, though, so I get why that isn't a very enticing prospect. What Gorilla Bunny says here is pretty consistent with a lot of my thoughts on how we combat the burnout and fatigue that inevitably comes with long-term sustained engagement in politics. And it's consistent with my own experience of being politically engaged with organizers who I know from communities that aren't inherently about politics, but that organizing emerges from it. So back to Yo of Zach, I would say hopefully that helps. Perhaps check out that video I referenced because there might be something there helpful. But I just wanted to personally say, as you feel this burnout, that to me, standing from where I am, hearing someone like you describe what you've been doing means so much. And while I feel your fatigue, I really hope that you, the same way I hope that I can find a way to keep persisting through it. It was quite the note to end on, but here we are, ending the end.